If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. In this episode, I want to talk about getting better, improving as a worker, doing what you do in ways that you feel are better. And I want to really drill down on that because I think that's the core thing you're interested in as you listen to my podcast. It's not just a question of being able to handle your stuff. It's a question of getting better at work, of getting better at our tasks, of getting better at our job. And it's all about making more money and being more effective in the world, creating more value and all these exciting things. I also want to encourage some thinking into the idea of how do I go about constantly improving as a worker? Why do I want to be constantly improving as a worker? Part of it is I want to get better results. So I've got to be better at what I do. And there's a question of how do I do that? What does getting better mean on the one hand? And on the other, what are the possible processes for getting better? I think we tend to default to one path for getting better. And I think we need to open ourselves up to another path for getting better. It's not that everybody does one and everybody ignores the other. It's that I think we default to a path that maybe we should rethink some. Of course, we're eliminating going to ask the boss. Not that you shouldn't do it, you should. If you have a boss, you should get his or her input. If you have customers, you should get their input on what it is you need to be doing to get better. But most customers and many bosses really won't know how you should go about getting better at what you do. And even if they do help you figure out how to get better, they're not all that interested in you getting better in ways that serve you. They want you to get better in ways that serve them. So for now, we'll assume that you've asked the boss. We'll assume that you've talked to colleagues or customers and that you've gotten that input. But now it's a question of what are my options and how do I go about really implementing a plan to get better and implementing a mindset around becoming a better worker. I think there are a few paths to improvement, naturally, or else I wouldn't be talking about options. I think the default one that we look into is, and my shorthand for this tactic is to go get an MBA, because I'm a business guy, and I think the probability is that you are a business person as well listening to this podcast. But go get an MBA is really shorthand for any number of recognized credentials that take or formal learning that award a formal recognition of some piece of learning, whether it's terribly accurate or otherwise. So in this, we're talking about degrees, certifications, recognized learning experiences, however certified. But here we're talking about abstract things that you go and learn and then bring back in. And there's a specific flavor to how this works that we'll talk about in a little bit. But for shorthand, I'll say this is the MBA path, and I'll explain more later what I mean by this, but I think this is the big business person promotion path, if you will. I think if you're in a situation where you're in a corporate hierarchy and there's an opportunity for promotions, I think this is more the natural path to do that. I think the other big chunk is process-based improvement, process-based getting better. So the first one is credential-based getting better. That means that somebody else, an authority, has said, you know more, so you should be better. The second generic group of things we could do is getting better on our own terms. And what does that mean? I think it has to do with producing more value. I think that the primary difference is in a corporate setting with an MBA, it's presumed that you're more valuable because you have more credentials. On the other hand, outside of that corporate structure, the only way to create more value is to literally create more value. There's no presumption, if you will, or the correlation is much weaker between a credential and an increase in value that you're able to charge for. So I think that's why there's two big chunks of ways to improve. So in the second path, this is where we work on our job rather than at our job. This is where we study our processes. This is where we study our practical skill set as compared to going and sitting in class and understanding an abstract knowledge set. So if we're pursuing path two, and there's a couple or three different ways to do that, and we'll detail those. If you're pursuing that second path, then it's available to anyone and it's self-defined. In fact, it's very difficult to go to formal learning and say, how do I produce more value? Because formal learning is very oriented towards a credential. I'm not saying credentials are bad. I have several, so I must like them. I'm just saying that that's one approach versus another approach is a process level getting better and a result-based level getting better. So we'll talk about what that does. Another notion in the second path is that typically things on the second path, you'll spend time to free up time versus things on the first path, you'll spend time to get credential. So that's another thought as well, and we'll explore what that is. But for now, let's just think that there are two big chunks. One is credentials, and the other is to work on what we do, practical steps of how do we do our jobs. Now, in the second path, I said something about freeing up time. So I think that's important because time is a very flexible commodity. You can do a lot of things with it. In some ways, it's like money. So if what I have to do to earn my income takes less of my time, and of course, when I talk about time, I also am putting attention in there as well. If improving means that what I do to make my monthly living takes less time than it did 6 months ago, then I can do things with that extra time. And there are various examples, but it's very flexible. So one thing, for example, I can use that extra time to acquire additional clients, to grow my business, so to speak. So that's one way to do it. And that's one way to produce value, to harvest value from having this extra time. Another way to use the extra time that's produced by getting better at what you do is to figure out how to produce more value per customer. So let's say you have 10 customers and that takes you 50 hours a week, and you work on your process for a little while and you recognize that you can automate or cut steps or outsource some things. And then you find that you're able to produce for those 10 customers, instead of in 50 hours, you're able to produce for them in 40 hours. So that means you have 10 hours in your work week. And one way to use that 10 hours would be, now that I understand my customers, what new product line or what enhancement could I add to the services I give them that will incentivize them to pay me more money, or will allow me to justify raising my prices, for example. So the time flexibility is great, and this comes from working on your job. The third primary use of free time is just that, is use it as free time. If you could produce your income in 35 hours a week rather than 45 hours a week, then what could you do with that additional 10 hours of time and mental energy that you're no longer spending having to create your income? So that's a valid reason too. And we'll talk about all three of these things as we go forward. One of the big thoughts in this conversation is we want to be aware that we have options on this thing. I fear that many people fall into the default path of, well, I'll just go get more education. And there's a real challenge or trap to that I'll talk about in a minute. But for now, let's just emphasize the fact that getting better at what you do, there are several options probably for you to get better, and they each have slightly different targets. And so that's what we want to think about, is that we have options in how to do this. I will say, as an aside right here, I went back and forth on calling this one a lie. And I never actually figured out whether or not I wanted to do that. So you can take this as a lie or leave it as a lie. But I want to bring it up because I'm using the format of an episode about lies. So we'll go in, we've talked about what the problem is. And I think the problem is this default thinking where we simply default to going to get better credentials as we're working to get better. And by better credentials, I don't just mean credentials, I just mean more knowledge, more theoretical knowledge about what we do. More, if you're an accountant and you're a bookkeeper and a CPA kind of path, then you go and learn about tax kinds of paths. And CPAs are probably saying, hey, Larry, you're wrong. That's not the way it works. But you get the idea. Adding on chunks of skill set tends to be this default path. And I just want to make sure that we understand that there are options. So to the degree that there's a lie, the lie is this presumption that I have to go get more technical knowledge about what I do in order to get better at it. So I'm heavily exploring the other options here. So when we think about a new mindset around this, a new way of thinking about this problem, the first thing we want to do is to understand what we actually mean when we say getting better. And part of that is making a distinction on the first two, right? Do I need a credential so that the people that define my salary for me have evidence that I'm more valuable, or have evidence that I could skip town and get a better job with the competitor, and so they're going to have to raise my income in order to make that work, or give me special assignments, or these sorts of things. And the other path is just simply getting better at our job for our own ends. So that's the first thing we want to check into for getting better. But I think that there are 3 or 4 ways that we could really improve if we look at it from a new mindset. And I'll detail each one of those and we'll decide how many we've got. I think the first one is the first one we talked about previously, which is more knowledge The MBA path, more specialization, more technical knowledge about our job. And when we look at this, maybe the prime example would be somebody whose field is medicine. And they learn a particular skill set while they're going through medical school, and they start practicing. And then they recognize that there's a specific component of their practice that's more interesting to them. And so they go and get additional certifications in that specific part of medicine. And this is probably wrong, but I think of, an oral surgeon going to learn everything there is about tonsils and then becoming the regional tonsil expert, right? We see this in orthopedics, I believe, where people as orthopedic surgeons will specialize in a specific kind of surgery. Maybe it's knee replacement. And they churn out knee replacements, perhaps hundreds of times a year, and really become specialists at that as compared to a more generalist approach. So that's what I'm thinking about when I think about this MBA technical knowledge path. And it's doable really in any field where you can have a major in business school. So if you're in the field of finance, well, you can get more knowledge and more sophisticated degrees. Maybe you had an undergrad, you can now go get a master's. In any business school discipline, you have an undergrad in whatever your major is, you can go get an MBA. So these are the kinds of things that are on my mind when we talk about this option. And there are really, I think, two flavors of this, which is where it gets a little bit more complex. So hang in there with me. So the first flavor of this is this technical specialization that we talked about a minute ago, that enables you to engage in a different kind of pursuit. It's the opportunity to add a more demanding skill into your existing practice, if you will. Maybe you get certified to do business in another state, would be a good example of this one, where you have to go past their licensing exam, and thus you get a license, which is a credential, and that allows you to do this. In the real estate business, I'm aware that there are two different kinds of license. There's a realtor license, membership of the board of realtors, and then there's also a broker's license, which requires additional knowledge and additional testing. In the project management space, the Project Management Institute will certify you as a project management professional, which has to do with gathering more knowledge, and then allows you to do these additionally high-level roles in a project management scenario. So I'd say one is that technical specialization. The second flavor of this, I would say, has something to do with tightening your niche, right? So if you're a lawyer, maybe you go study divorce law and then you become primarily a divorce lawyer. And this goes back to, I'm not sure that there's a specific certification for that, but it's pretty easy to visualize. And tightening your niche produces additional value in ways that are fairly complex. And I think probably we'll get to how that actually works later in our conversation today. So we take those two flavors of more knowledge, and then we want to see if our approach is going to make sense. The key takeaway from this path is that it's very rare that more knowledge simply equals better performance, or that more knowledge simply equals more money. again, if you're in a corporate job and you go to your boss and you say, hey, I can go get this MBA degree and then apply that new knowledge into the company, it should make me more valuable and open me up for other projects and other positions within the company. How do you feel about this? Well, it's a defined thing, and then you can probably negotiate some plan for getting that credential. On the other hand, if you're not in a corporate setting and you're doing your own thing and you want to go get more technical knowledge, you need to be very careful about looking at your field and what does more knowledge do for people in your field. Because it is challenging when you go get new information, when you go get new knowledge, when you specialize more. I think this kind of specialization makes sense in certain fields. Medical, certainly. Lawyers, almost definitely. CPAs, probably. A project management professional, a PMP certification probably works this way. But it's not automatically true. And you can tell this by there's not any real granularity to it. So if you're going to get a credential, say an MBA, that may raise your income. But if you go take one course in finance that could work towards your MBA degree, that's not necessarily going to get you a raise. So it's not progressive in that sense. I will say there's a challenge to more knowledge and more specialization. If you go get more technical knowledge, then you're probably learning more and more about less and less. Programmers call it edge cases. So you're going to find out this abstract, this arcane information that you might be presented with in your work, but it's by definition, it's very rare. And as such, we've got to make sure that the investment in understanding that edge case works out to value produced by being able to handle an edge case. So I think there's lots of people who feel like they need to go get a college degree or something, but they don't really know why. And so I want to be careful with that. But that's one way we can go about trying to get better, is to go and start the process of gaining more knowledge, more specialization, more technical knowledge. And all of these paths are risky. I think maybe the least risky is the certification path, but that may be because of my psychology and my makeup. The one thing that getting a PhD proves is not that you're terribly smart. It proves that you are a pretty good student. And that's just a thing that's probably true about me that may not be true about everybody. So I want to recognize that all of these things are risky. And I want to acknowledge my own bias that this first one, it seems the least risky to me, but I don't have statistics on it. So more technical knowledge, MBA. A second path of improving, getting better, is to look at your processes and refine them in such a way that you're creating more, and I'll say widgets. You're producing more instances of some well-known part of what you do. This probably involves automation on your part. If you're a accountant and your practice is about helping individuals do their taxes, this is work on your process so that you can do more tax returns in the same amount of effort, time. Okay. Creating more outputs, creating more of existing outputs. Okay. And it, as I said, probably involves some automation. It may involve some additional new knowledge, but it's probably not what you would consider to be technical knowledge about being an accountant. It's more like process knowledge. It's significantly more experimental. You have to ask questions about, okay, what tools should I be using? What steps can I omit? And that way we can learn to create more widgets. Recognize that it's not about working more hours. It's not about applying more attention to get these more widgets done, because that's not really an improvement. That's just an extension. And that way lies the trap of burnout and these sort of things. What I'm talking about is, let's create more widgets per unit input, per unit effort or time. So that's the second one, maybe, is creating these more widgets. The next one I'm going to call raising prices, but I think it also means increasing the value you produce per result. I alluded to this earlier, and probably the simplest example is to think about creating ways in your process to create more value, thus be able to raise your prices. Okay. So I think many people are afraid of raising their prices. It's really kind of funny, because in my coaching, when I work with small business people, sometimes they'll say, well, I've got more customers than I can handle, so I need to hire somebody. Well, actually, there's a second path that people don't tend to think of, and it's, if you're hiring somebody, then you're increasing the supply of whatever it is you do. The other side of that is to control the demand for what you do. And in order to do that, it's pretty simple. You just raise your prices. Okay. So let's say, here's an example of raising your prices. So let's say you've got 10 customers and they produce $1,000 a month in revenue. So that's $10,000 a month. Let's say we go and ask generally for a 10% price increase, and we get it from 9 of our 10 customers. And the 10th customer says, no, I'm not interested in your price increase. I'm going to go find another vendor. And you say, okay. So just doing the math, each one of our remaining customers is now worth $1,100 a month, but there's only 9 of them. So instead of making $10,000 a month, we're now making $9,900 a month. So we've lost $100 a month. But we're presumably, all things being equal, we presumably just bought back 10% of our time. So we've lost 1% of our revenue, but gained 10% of our time, attention, energy to address these things. And that's probably a pretty good trade-off, okay? Add to that, and I may mention this again later, add to that, if you're selective about it, you can probably get rid of your worst customer. And by worst, I mean that customer that sucks up a disproportionate amount of time, that customer for which you're constantly having to tweak things, for whom they're never satisfied, and they always are demanding a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And so they're probably sucking up a disproportionate amount of your attention and energy. And so if you're careful about how you raise prices, then maybe you can get rid of them and raise your prices with the rest of the customers who are already surprised at what an astonishing value you're delivering. But that's another way to get better, is to raise prices and produce more value per unit of output. I'll say the fourth one, and don't sleep on this one. The fourth one is simply time savings for its own sake. Now, in business speak, we typically think of saving time so that we can reinvest that time and go back into, for example, customer acquisition, or go back into delivering more value. But sometimes we want to save time just to save time. It's perfectly legitimate if you're cruising along making your $10,000 a month and you find a way to save 10% of your time, to just, with 90% of the effort and energy, you produce 100% of the income, and you use that 10% to engage in another part of your life. That's perfectly legitimate. Outside interests that may at some point generate viable work for you, whatever that looks like. So don't sleep on that. And again, time, spare attention, spare energy is a very fungible, right? Can be applied a lot of different ways in order to improve your lifestyle. So that's the fourth one. Don't sleep on, I'm creating efficiency just so I have more time to myself, particularly if you're one of these folks that's working 55 and 60 hours a week. So let's summarize briefly ways to get better. So number one is this MBA path, this certification path, this more technical knowledge about your specialty idea. This one probably, as I said, probably works best if you're in a corporate environment where your value is usually inferred rather than determined by the marketplace. Perfectly useful way to go about things. I think there's a trap there in that we know more and more about less and less, which is the joke about PhD students. So I'm certainly qualified to talk about this, about knowing more and more about less and less. And there are specific situations where you can harvest value from that, but it's not universal. So the first idea is to go get certification, promotion, additional degrees. Number two is to gain knowledge, information, training so that you can niche down and raise more value per customer. So this would be maybe not technical knowledge per se, but would be to go study a part of your customer base and to see what they might need from you above and beyond what you deliver to a generic crowd of customers. So that's number two. Number three is more throughput, more widgets per unit, effort, time, attention, however you want to measure that. And what that can do is it can either allow us to increase our instances of output. If it takes less inputs to make a unit of output, then we can, with our original inputs, make more outputs and thus get better. Then that's number three there. And then number four is harvesting time for other pursuits. And it may very well be that you need to get better at what you do so that you can harvest that time and apply it in other areas. And I think that's a terribly valuable way to get better and define getting better in that way. So according to our structure now, we'll talk about the results of this new mindset. There's an idea that I've talked about before, and I think it's important here. So the two big categories of getting better, one is external certification, external qualification that's awarded by some authority or respected body. So that's one general category of getting better. The other is to get better by our own definitions, to get better from a process perspective as compared to a knowledge perspective, to get better in the sense of more efficient rather than more knowledgeable, more effective, if you will, rather than more knowledgeable. And I talk about this as parallel to athletics. In any professional sport, the highest level people in the sport work very hard on their athleticism, and they have specific trainers for their fitness level, for their cardiovascular stuff, strength training, speed training. And all of these things are distinct from their study of their technical specialty. And that is how to swing a golf club, how to swing a tennis racket, or the history of the game, or strategy in the game. So they think a lot about nutrition and mental preparedness and these ideas versus the more technical aspects of their game. And I think we as knowledge workers perhaps don't give this athleticism notion enough time. enough brain space, because there are certainly things that we can do to generically improve as a worker, to become more, and I've searched for a term here, I can't even coin a term that makes any sense. That's this underlying skill set of work. This underlying skill set of work applies as much to a lawyer as it does to an accountant. Our ability to handle the information and to apply the knowledge and to produce the outputs that are needed in any knowledge work profession. I think we support a lot of waste in these areas. And I personally would love to see us do away with those wastes and by that get better. And it's really interesting because there's a couple of ways this works out in athletics. So if you're a professional athlete, let's just say a tennis player, and you get better at your athletics, that is, you get more stamina, more strength, more speed, all these different kinds of things, then there's really two ways that that helps you. One is it helps you to produce better under live fire. So for a tennis player, you play better during matches because you get to more balls, you can hang in longer towards the end of the match, you don't tire as easily, all these kinds of things. And that's great in a live fire production environment. But the other thing, and much more subtle, is your fitness level also allows you to practice harder. So in those times when it's time to practice, you're able to practice longer before your physical tiredness interferes with what you're trying to learn. Right. And that second aspect of it is very subtle, but I think probably quite pronounced, because if I can practice 10% longer than you can, that accumulates just like compound interest. So I'm not just practicing 10% more or 10% harder than you today. I'm practicing 10% harder than you every day. And that should accrue in the same way as compound interest accrues. And while the differences might be slight in the beginning, over time, they're really going to show to be broad differences. So I think as we work on our athleticism in the workplace, and I wish I could come up with a term for this, I continue to try, then both things happen. So if we're better at our work, then we're better at each instance of production. But we're also better at thinking about our work. We're also better at trying to improve our work processes. And so this twofold result is there for us as well. Of course, as you might expect from me, I think one of the core work athletic fields, one of the core knowledge work athleticism approaches is to get on top of our task and attention management. There are several different things you can do, but getting on top of our task and attention management, I think, is the greatest contribution to this notion of work athletics. And I can talk about that at great length. That's what Attention Compass is for, is to make you better at your task and attention management, to free up your mental energies, to free up your attention such that you can apply it where you think it needs to be and not waste it or fritter it away in ways that are not valuable to you. Things like finding documents, things like every morning trying to think about what you need to do, things like not having good processes for managing your tasks. All these things are just costs, and I identify them typically as wastes. I think we can eliminate that waste. And then you'll be better prepared to do these other things, to think about how can I go about getting a promotion? If you handle tasks very well, if you handle tasks and attention very well, you'll be a better student. Okay. If you handle tasks and attention very well and free up blocks of time to think deeply about something, it'll be easier for you to think of ways to raise value per customer or to niche down. If you're doing these hygiene things, these athletic things, it'll be easier for you to think about how to produce more throughput in your processes. Certainly, the same is true for harvesting time for other pursuits. So I think this is a fundamental skill. And I definitely want you to consider working with me on an attention compass implementation of your own. And if you can do that, then I think that's the equivalent of being a more athletic pro athlete in the knowledge workspace. So we can work on that in ways that I hope will be easy for you and pretty short in duration. Now that we've talked about that, I think that there are some other results that you get from this. I think when you change your mindset, you begin to, instead of just thinking, well, I need to go get a degree, you can now think about how do you produce your results. You begin to get introspective about your work. And an example of this introspection, I'll give you real briefly, is this podcast. This is the 21st episode of the podcast. And over time, I've learned how to, in some ways, make the process of podcast production better. One thing that is true about creating a podcast that I didn't think would be true is it takes up a large amount of time. It currently, I'll say, uses up about 8 hours per episode in productive time. And I can go into detail about how that works, but you can probably imagine what it is. And so I'm working to get better at those pieces so that it shortens up in terms of time, in terms of attention required to produce a podcast without dramatically changing the output. I'm rather fond of the output. And I'm getting feedback from you all that'll help me define that even better. So if you have an idea about how I can make this better, please let me know. One thing I can do better to produce more value in the podcast, let me know that. But I'm thinking about how this work product gets produced. And I have insights into how that works. I can outsource components of it, for example. I can improve my skills. So one of the things that I'm working on is improving my skill. I call it my radio voice. Improving my skill at translating my outline into words with fewer hesitations and filler words and ums and ahs. Well, why would I do that? I'll do that because it shortens the editing process. So this is roughly an hour-long podcast. The minimum amount of time it takes to edit an hour of audio is an hour, because at a minimum, even if you don't make any corrections, you've got to listen to the whole thing. So if I can get better at producing words into the microphone, into the recording, then perhaps it's possible to eliminate that editing step altogether. Another way that I could spend less attention, less mental energy, less time on creating the podcast, and I have to credit my wife with this one, would be to shorten it, would be to go from an hour to 30 minutes. And it's reasonable to ask, how would that wind up reducing the amount of effort that you put into producing the podcast? Well, the example that I used before, if they're 30-minute recordings, then the minimum time to edit one is not an hour, it's now 30 minutes. And the minimum required time to record it is also 30 minutes. So in just 2 steps out of about 6, I could save an hour of production time, attention, effort. So if you think about it, and the shorten it didn't occur to me as an efficiency measure. So it just goes to show you that you have to think about this stuff and maybe bring your beautiful and brilliant wife in on the topic to help you think of more ways to produce with less effort, time, attention. Another mental approach to this is look at your own workflow. Look at the way your thing gets created. Look at it from the standpoint of results. What are the categories of result that I'm producing? And it's easy to get, well, I'll say, thoughtless about this. Well, I produce a tax return. Well, that's fine. What are the easier tax returns to produce and what are the harder tax returns to produce? Which ones involve less effort and which ones involve more effort? Why do the ones that involve more effort involve more effort? Is there some way that I can bill for that additional effort or make a clear decision whether to eliminate those kinds of customers from my core customer base? Maybe I eliminate them and focus on simpler tax returns. Maybe I double down with this more complicated crowd and focus on more complicated tax returns so that I can then get into that process and understand it and make it easier, faster, better. So look at your results. Look at the visibility of your product. Look at whether or not the things that you're doing, the independent individual steps of production, are actually visible to your customer or desired by your customer. So it would be easy to spend an hour tweaking the font on a report. Your customer may never notice. And certainly if they don't notice, they're going to be hard pressed to share value with you to cover that additional hour. So can you remove that hour of effort for a result that really has no visibility at the customer level or at the output level? So thinking about that, am I producing something that's invisible? And invisible, of course, is probably a metaphor, but you get the idea. Look at your own workflow. What can I do to create more instances of production? Where can I shorten the amount of attention, time, energy I need to spend on a step and thus collapse that? And these things interact, these three things in particular interact in very interesting ways. But just some thoughts about how to look at your workflow and potentially make it better. Another result, and this is really subtle, but as we get better, as we propose to ourselves projects to work on something and get better at something, and those projects succeed, then we also wind up having more confidence about doing what we do. And that's terribly valuable. You're able to jump in there and really pitch, really engage with a new project rather than having to challenge yourself to engage with it, because you've got this confidence where if you've never done something before and you're fearful of failing, then that really acts to sap our productivity. Briefly, we'll run down some tools that we can use to implement this new mindset. And some of this is going to be review, but I want to make sure that we get this into your hands, that I get this into your hands as well. So the first tool that we'll use is this categorization of what getting better means to you. Don't be generic here. Be as precise as you can be. And when you think of getting better, it's easy to default to, well, more knowledge is going to make me better. Maybe, probably, not definitely. So think in very precise terms, what does getting better mean to me? And then pursue that getting better. And I've given you 4 different ways to think about getting better. More knowledge, more instances of production, more value created per instance of production, or just harvesting time? What does getting better mean to you? If you decide that you're going to go for the certification MBA, more technical knowledge path, think about specialization versus niche. As you're acquiring more information, the formal information path is probably going to move you in the direction of specialization. The informal knowledge gathering path will probably move you in the direction of a niche in your current market that can be more valuable to serve than perhaps serving a broad market. In the same vein, think about how can you collect more value per instance of delivery. Think about raising your prices. And this is real simple. You can test it out. Go figure out who your worst customer is and tell them, I'm going to raise your price. Now, this is easier in a self-employed scenario, in a solo business person scenario, than it is in an organizational scenario. But even in an organizational scenario, right, you can do this by exploring what people that do what you do are making. And think about, how can I collect more value? How can I raise my prices? And then finally, look for more deliveries. Make your process faster in terms of time. Make it utilize less energy. Make it utilize less mental space. And these are the simple blocking and tackling things. How good are you at manipulating a keyboard? Are you a good typist? Do you understand how to use your tools? Are you constantly fumbling around trying to figure out how to get an email off how to get a voicemail off your phone? And learn these things and look for areas of wasted attention or time and streamline these things. Think about your software. Am I using my software well? If you're constantly touching spreadsheets in your work, are you really good at spreadsheets? Are there hotkey combinations that you could learn rather than having to use the mouse or the touch screen all the time, because those things are slow? In just about any field of human endeavor, a piece of low-hanging fruit is communication, public speaking, getting your ideas across. Are there ways that you could work on that? Can you practice? Can you get an app? Can you do a few recordings of yourself on Zoom at home and just get your own feedback for how you might do better? But these are pretty basic ways that really immediately return time, energy back into your system. So don't be too proud. Don't be too vain to consider what 10 minutes a day of typing practice might do to your overall typing speed. And if you do a lot of typing, then typing faster is a great way to gain some productivity back. All these ideas, less attention per instance of production. And how do we go about doing that? Your process is not mysterious. Model your process, write your process down, and that'll help you think about it. As long as it's this, oh, I have to wait for inspiration, then it's very difficult to modify that. It's very difficult to optimize that. So create a process and begin to study it and begin to think about, oh, there are 10 steps here. Is there one I can eliminate? Okay. And finally, I'll say, once again, a primary tool here is attention compass. The goal of attention compass is to help you eliminate waste in your task and attention management. And I talked about this a good bit earlier, so I won't beat you to death here about it. But if you want to do something like that, there's ways to proceed. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find out there. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Tell me you listen to the podcast. If this is your first experience with our podcast, feel free to subscribe and to listen to us more often. I enjoy doing these, and I've done 21 of them, so presumably I'm now in it for the long haul. So you can expect me to be in your inbox or your podcast stream every week. Love to have you do that. Also, you can go out and take a look at the Do Busy Right website. Right now, we're offering a tickler file creation script. So if you're interested in this stuff and you haven't done a whole lot about managing your own time and attention, a tickler file is a great place to start. So if you go out to dobusyright.com/tickler-file, then you can give me your email address and I'll send you a PDF script for how to create a tickler file so that you're constantly on top of your reminders, so that you can constantly be aware of your postponement decisions. And I did a podcast on this not too long ago, and not worry about things falling through the cracks. And if you're not worried about forgetting things falling through the cracks, then you can postpone them with more freedom and more quickly. So think about Attention Compass as a tool as well. So a brief recap of what we've talked about. We're talking about getting better. And what does that mean in our world? There are many ways to get better, and we covered 4 of them here in our conversation. And I think the biggest takeaway is don't just default. Don't just assume that the only way to do this is to go, if you have a bachelor's, get a master's. And if you have a master's, go get a Ph.D. Don't just assume that formal learning and formal knowledge about your specialty is the only way to go here. Think about the other ways to get better. Think about your knowledge work athleticism. Think about, am I doing the right kind of research? Am I finding new information out the right ways? Am I able to manage my attention and task list? And this athleticism, that one of the core pieces is managing attention. Think about the different tools that you have in your hands. Don't sleep on the simple stuff. Learn your things. If typing is your thing, learn it. If a particular piece of software is something you spend a lot of time on, learn that software. Think about hotkeys. Think about learning to speak and communicate better than you do right now. So think about all these things. So I hope that this has helped you think more about how to go about getting better, and really reinforces the fact that that's what the Do Busy Right site and Attention Compass and my own philosophy is all about. It's working with you to help you get better at what you do. How you harvest from getting better is entirely up to you. You can do it with more money, you can do it with free time, you can do it with more knowledge. But I'm all about improvement, and I hope that we've emphasized that for you today. So think about that as you go forward. Feel free to reach out in ways that I've already talked about. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.